everybody. Welcome to another episode of Unqualified Experts. I'm your corrupt overlord, Shane.
And I'm your other host, Braden Gardner.
And I remembered the name of the show on the first take, so Braden owes me $20. Told you.
Look, law averages.
So today we are doing a quick one on a topic that, well, do you love it or do you love to hate it? You all have those games, and you know what? I'm just going to say it. Some of the popular board games suck and I hate them.
Amen.
So, as we believe this is a sentiment a lot of you probably share, we're just going to go through the quick list of the games that call them overrated, call them lousy, call them whatever, rage-inducing. But here's a list of games where the table flip or board flip is not out of play. Would you like to start off this bastion of joy?
Oh, yeah. And we're each going to go over our top 3 popular games we love to hate. And my number 3 pick for this list is honestly a game that I can enjoy playing, but it was just played ad nauseum when it first came out, and it was literally the only game that anybody would trot out during a gathering of friends or a party or any other occasion, and that's Cards Against Humanity.
I kind of sensed where that was going once you said it was the only thing.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, Cards Against Humanity is a fun game, and it's not one that I will have a bad time playing necessarily, but I'm never going to be excited to play this game because it's just not that interesting after you've played through 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 15, 30 times. And a lot of the jokes are just the same thing over and over again. And the more I thought about why I just couldn't get excited for this game, I kind of liken it to what happened to Family Guy after they got canceled after season 3 way back when. And they were gone for a few years, and then Fox renewed them in season 4 many years later. And it always seemed like the humor was more and more derived toward Seth MacFarlane, basically trying to see how far he could push the envelope with Fox. And that's kind of where I feel like a lot of the humor with Cards Against Humanity winds up. Other games like Joking Hazard, which are in the same vein, I find a lot more enjoyable because the artwork actually adds another layer to the humor in the comic panel system that actually makes it a lot more interesting and, well, funny.
Yeah, and Cards Against Humanity definitely opened the door, and I'm glad they were a big thing because it basically opened up the space for a lot of other different types of games or to push the envelope in other ways. But I think you're kind of right. There was just a point. For you, apparently, it was game 30. For me, I think it was 50 or 55. Where I'm like, you know what? I kind of know the punchline of all the jokes at this point, no matter how you mix the cards up. And it just lost a little bit of its luster. It's not a bad game, but it's like when you see the shiny gold versus the dull brass. There's just a point where
You're over it.
You're over it. Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Okay, good pick. I can definitely see that. So for me, it's the game of Risk. I mean, I know we say Settlers is kind of the first strategy game everyone gets into, but if we're honest, you could probably go a little bit earlier to Risk. You want to conquer the world, you get your armies, and I get why it's a simple game. It's a dice game. You roll the dice, the armies attack. It is what it is. It is a great way to get, the young nephews who are 5 or 6 or 10 into it, but the number of people high school age or college age who still like Risk. Look, I've played Phil.
Condolences.
Look at my 3 guys who roll 18 6s against your 20. Yeah, I'm done. I'm over it. No, there's just a certain point where, okay, you learn that strategy games are a thing. That's like Risk. Fine, I'll use the random example since you did a great one with Family Guy. I'll do it to rock and roll. Foreigner. They're high school rock. When you're in high school, they're so deep, man. And then at some point you realize partway through your early 20s, you just stopped listening and forgot about them. And, aside from some great references from Aqua Teen Hunger Force, go Carl, there was just a point where you realized, they're not bad, they're just there was a point where you realized, oh, this is kind of the base of what songs can do, and then you went on to much better music with actual much deeper songs when you had life experience. Kind of same here. Risk, cool. Strategy games, they're a thing. By high school, Settlers, Axis and Allies, new ones like Bunny Kingdom, there's just no excuse to put yourself through the complete random dice rolling luck of Risk. You should not be able to conquer the entire world from West Madagascar. Phil.
Yeah, I don't really have a lot to add with this one. Risk is not actually a game that I've played all the way through, but I've watched people play it periodically, and I gotta say, I have watched games where someone had no business even surviving the turn, let alone mounting a comeback, and just watching the right dice rolls come down and seeing the exasperated look on the would-be victor's face as the tables were turned, sometimes literally, in response to the unfair dice god rolls that just propel those chosen few to victories that should just not have been possible.
Yeah, table flipping, fully allowed for Risk, in my opinion.
Not this table, though. Never flip this one. Too heavy.
We'll see.
Anyhow, speaking of strategy games, this one's probably going to be the most contentious entry on either of our lists. And don't get me wrong, it is a well-designed game. I acknowledge that. A lot of care and love went into it. The factions are interesting. The artwork is adorable. But I just can't get into Root. I've tried. And I think a lot of it just stems from how the base game makes me feel about each of the factions. Originally, I picked up the game because I read about the Vagabond. And having the troublemaker who basically plays table politician, goes about and aligns themselves with the faction that they feel is most likely to win, and then having it be a joint victory, that's kind of cool. That's not something you've really seen in a lot of board games. But playing any of the other base factions is just so frustrating. You've got the Marquis de Cat, who start off with an amazingly strong board position, but you're in an amazingly strong board position, so while it is a great one for beginners to work with, it's frustrating to basically be forced onto the defensive until you can figure out what foothold you can set up and start to more firmly reestablish your control of the board. You're basically set up to deteriorate from turn one.
Yeah.
And then you've got the Irie Dynasties. They're probably my favorite of the base factions because they do reward strategic planning, and as you build up more and more moves per turn, you can use that to really steamroll the table. But there's a very fine line between careful strategic planning and surgical strategic planning, and the Irie Dynasty requires very surgical play. If you mess up even a little, you're going to get sent back to the Stone Age. And then you have the Woodland Alliance, and I have kind of a love-hate relationship with these guys. On the one hand, they can be really, really strong, extremely disruptive, and they can pull in a lot of points out of nowhere. But the very first game we played, Shane played the Woodland Alliance, and I was able to basically lock him out of the game from an early point, which kind of leads me to the conclusion if a first-time player could figure out how to do that, more experienced tables probably see that happen more often than not, and that just feels bad in its own right.
Yeah, and that's a fair criticism. It's one of those where it was fun to cause mischief, but the moment my mischief came to, oh, there's some strategy here, I could become a power player, and done. And it was kind of like that South Park scene with the economy. It was like, and you're done. It's gone. It's like, oh, okay. I'm sitting at the table now. And I think a lot of factions kind of feel like that, where there's just a very quick turning point where you just realize, oh, I'm pretty much done. The Vagabond's fun, but it does feel like a game that was almost designed as a spotlight to the one faction pretty much every single player will want to play because I feel like it's the funnest one on the board.
For sure.
Not close.
And we've played the first expansion as well,
Mm-hmm.
and it really hasn't changed my opinion on the base game. The other factions are neat, but if your base game isn't compelling, it's going to be very difficult to get me on board with a shiny new expansion.
Yeah. And that's fair. And it's, again, I see why it's popular. I see why it got the attention. The artwork's awesome.
Yeah, absolutely.
And some of the mechanics are really, really interesting. But as a whole, I don't think I dislike it as much as you do, but I think there's a lot of legitimate gripes, especially for certain types of players. Okay, well, number 2 on my list is interesting. Because you think you know how to play it. You don't, and that's the problem.
No, I totally do.
You don't. Just no one does. And that is the game of Monopoly. And for anyone who's actually bothered to go through and read the rules, yeah, you know what Monopoly is? It is a relatively short, succinct, streamlined game that should be done in 3 to 4 hours. And with all of you looking at me saying, what the hell are you talking about? That is the problem. First of all, if anyone says, well, let's play Monopoly, you have to figure out what home rules they're using. Because I have never played a game of Monopoly that didn't have home rules in it. And most of the time, the people didn't even know they were playing with home rules. I mean, look, there's no cash and free parking.
Oh,
and I get that.
My windfall.
I know. But, like, the first time I brought up the auction rule, everybody looked at me at the table like I was trying to pull a quick one. If you land on a property and you don't buy it, it goes to auction. That's not a home rule. That is actually the game. The property must sell to someone. And if you land on Boardwalk and you look around the table and realize all the chumps have $100, yes, you can decline to buy it and then buy it for $101 instead of the listing price. That is a viable option, family who doesn't play Monopoly with me anymore. Just, hypothetically speaking. The other one I say all the time, everyone adds more houses and hotels. There's supposed to be a shortage. That's what keeps the game streamlined. That makes the 4 houses and not upgrading to hotels a viable strategy. It's what makes the slumlord strategy work if you hit those properties early enough. You just choke everyone else out. And it makes for a faster game. It makes for a smoother game. And honestly, is one of those where you play by the rules. It's actually a fun game that you can get done in an afternoon. You can start it at 1, and by the time family dinner for the holiday is there, you guys are done and over with it. Instead, you have all these home rules, just adjusting a little bit here or there, and it turns into a long, grueling slog of hurt feelings, heavy dice luck, loans. When the hell did loans come into Monopoly? I will die on that hill. Loans should not be a home rule for Monopoly. And then you're looking as you suddenly land on Boardwalk with a hotel, which shouldn't have a hotel because it should have been locked out 10 turns ago, but there's an endless supply of hotels because credit or something, I don't know. No one knows how to play Monopoly, and the changes, although they sound good on paper, make it a much worse game, and that is why I hate Monopoly.
And that's completely fair. I mean, I grew up with a number of the electronic versions on the NES, and even as handheld games that you could just take on the go. So, yeah, a lot of the home rules do actually take a lot of the brevity out of Monopoly, and I use the term brevity very loosely. And as far as the loans bit, I 100% agree. The banker should just be committing straight-up robberies and taking what he wants.
I mean, yeah, where I didn't even go into that part of how that always happens in the family, but, it's, thank you for helping me make my point.
Yeah, no problem. I got you. Well, speaking of games that don't reward strategy in quite the same way, we've kind of established that we really like linear strategy games. The more that you turn to things like dice luck and Risk, or you start adding a million rules in Monopoly to make the gameplay bog down and be terrible. There's another game that has a very unique take on strategy, and I acknowledge that, and it works for a certain subset of people who aren't me. But I just can't get behind Dixit. Dixit, for those who are less familiar, is a game where players are going to take turns selecting a card in their hand, and all of the cards feature artwork. You are going to give a description of whatever that artwork is, and that description can be as long or short as you see fit, basically. Then you put it face down, and everyone picks a card in their hand that most closely corresponds to the description that you gave. And you have to hope that you don't do too well, because if nobody picks your card, you don't get points. If everybody picks your card and you go the other end of the spectrum, you still don't get points. So you have to hope that most people get your card, but there's at least one person that you fool in order to move ahead. And then when it isn't your turn, you're trying to muscle in on getting the points that the original card layer is trying to ensure that they're walking that tightrope on. And it's frustrating because the strategic value of that game is 100% subjective, even more so than a game like Cards Against Humanity or Apples to Apples, where you have a judge looking over and deciding which answer they like best. You have everyone deciding what answer they like best at random, and it just doesn't work for me. I find that game incredibly frustrating.
I mean, interesting. I can't really put into it because I've never played it. I had actually never even heard of it till you mentioned it, which apparently was shocking. The mechanics sound fun, but I know this is the wrong video to say that sounds interesting, want to play. But, yeah, I could see how something that's subjective. I mean, I ran into this a lot with Cards Against Humanity and games like that, where if you have like a really subtle type of sense of humor, that's not going to play in most groups on either side. And so I could see how that any games like that could be even more frustrating in that case. Alright, anything else you want to dump on that game?
No, I've pretty much got it. I mean, it's a fine game. Like, it's well designed. It's just...
Yeah.
It's the wrong type of random strategy, abstract stuff that... It just doesn't work for me.
Well, you probably had the most controversial one with Root at number 2, but if there was one that might compete with you on this list, it's probably my number 1. It's a game so many people were extremely excited about, me included when I first heard about it. And there's a lot to like about the game, and that is Sythe. I don't like it. And here's the thing. The art is beautiful. You know, I love the moody setup of the world. The steampunk post-World War I. The writing on the cards is fantastic. Their willingness to be extremely hilariously dark is just great. And it's right up my alley with having that sense of humor, being able to play this grim game, but then have stuff that's just busted gut funny as long as you're the right kind of terrible person. I am all about that. Which kind of makes it more heartbreaking to me that the game just doesn't work for me. It feels like a game I should like, but I just don't. Part of it is kind of the system of building up your faction. There's a really steep learning curve to it, and that's not bad in and of itself, but when I feel like I have to redo that learning curve every single time I sit back down to the game, that's a problem. It's one thing to do the steep learning curve after a few games and then pick up on the ins and outs and build off of that. When you feel like you're rebuilding from scratch each time, that's an issue. There's a lot of complexity there, and while complex games can be really, really good, I don't feel like they streamlined it as much as they could have. I don't feel like it's a setup that becomes intuitive over time. Like, you can force memorize it, but that's not the same thing. I think another part of it is depending on how the territories are placed out, how many players you have, the game can get really unbalanced and haphazard. I know in our online one, I had the expansion, kind of the Asian faction, which does a lot of really cool stuff. The trouble is, if you don't have any neighbors on the board, none of that matters until it's way, way too late in the game anyway. And so I might have kind of made Kingmaker, possibly, but, you know, by then. And I think the biggest issue is if you're having this mechanic post-war war type setup, the combat is boring and it's easy to manipulate in a really stupid way. Like, if we're set up for a giant battle and I commit a ton of forces and you decide to commit one, I'm screwed the rest of the game.
Mm-hmm.
And you get no penalty. There is no crushing defeat bonus for me. There is no, since he retreated most of his forces, you get half of them back or whatever. It's just, oh crap, he now has his whole military. You crush me the next turn, get your territory and the victory point back. And then, because of the way the game point system's designed, you're stupid if you don't immediately attack me again. And at that point, I have no military, so every other faction on the board should dogpile. And so it's one thing to say, well, plan out the strategy and all that, but you can literally build the largest military on the board, lose it in one turn, and then be defeated twice by every other faction for 2 points. And they have to almost intentionally sabotage themselves from best strategy to not dogpile on you once you're down. And the fact there's no check for that, and it's all basically comes down to, well, read his mind and guess how much he's committing. No, that does not belong in a strategy game that has this much going on in other areas.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. It's one of those where I really enjoy it, but I also tend to play a very military light game often when I'm playing Scythe. So I'm able to avoid a lot of that silliness because I'll have 7 million military cards in my hand waiting to basically push someone back and not engage on those points. But the criticisms there are extremely valid, particularly since I think part of the reason the game doesn't feel super streamlined is all of the factions play so differently from one another, which is a strength in and of itself, but there's so little commonality between them that it can be very easy to feel like you're learning the game over and over again for your first 6, 7, 8 playthroughs. And that's not a great way to get someone excited and invested in learning about a board game.
And I will say this in fairness, we have played a lot of 4-player games, and I get the feeling it plays much better when you're up to 6, 7, 8. I don't remember what the maximum players are.
I think it caps at 6.
6. It does feel like that if you're at 3 people or 4 people, there are balance issues.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's one where if it's fully filled out, then things work a lot more balanced and smoothly. But then at that point, that is a lot of chance to throw in a game where you're supposed to be in faction. And yeah, it's just one of those where I want to love it, and I love the concept, but I'm just not a Scythe fan, and I don't think it's going to win me over at this point.
Yeah, totally fair. I wouldn't mind trying a game with 6 people at some point, because I agree, I think it would be a very different experience.
So, alright, those are the board games, popular among many, that we frankly love to hate. So, Meeples, let us know what yours are down in the comments below. Please subscribe and like if you haven't. And, let us know. Is there a game we missed? Are we completely off our rockers and missing the point? Do not argue with me about loans or free parking. I'm not, no. Just
do it.
Wrap it up. Go ahead and wrap it up. I'm so angry right now.
Like Shane was saying, we definitely want to see what games you love to hate in the comments below. Definitely give us a like and subscribe if you haven't already. And till next time, great gaming.
If you like what you just saw, please support us by hitting that like button and subscribing to our channel for more great gaming content.